My husband and my mother-in-law thought the $2 million house was theirs. But when they threatened me with divorce, I let them know the truth. Now they can move in together, because that house was never theirs. It was mine all along, and now they're both out of my life. I'm Ava, a 31-year-old software analyst, and I used to believe that love meant compromise, that sometimes you just put up with things because, well, that's what people in love do. But I learned the hard way that sometimes compromise turns into being trampled, and love becomes manipulation dressed as devotion. When I met Mark, he seemed perfect, smart, charming, sweet. But most of all, he treated me like I was the center of his universe. What I didn't realize was that he had another son in his orbit, his mother, Diane. And trust me when I say, Diane didn't believe in sharing. In the beginning, her little comments were almost funny. "Oh, Ava, you don't really cook, do you?" "Mark always loved my pot roast." Or, "Are you sure that blouse is the best color for you, dear?" You know, the type of thing that sounds helpful, but leaves a bruise you can't quite explain. I laughed it off. I even told myself it was just her way of being protective. But as time passed, those little barbs became daggers. Still, I stayed. We got married. We had a daughter. I thought things would settle once we were a family. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Diane inserted herself into everything, where our daughter would go to daycare, what brand of diapers we should use, even how we should decorate our home. And Mark? Oh, he just nodded along. His go-to phrase? "Mom just wants what's best for us." The irony was, the house we lived in, the beautiful, spacious, $1 million home, was one I had inherited from my grandfather. I never told Mark. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I knew, deep down, once Diane found out, she'd see it as her domain. And I wasn't ready to fight that battle. Not yet. Fast forward to a few years into our marriage. Things were tense. I had taken a job that allowed me more time at home with our daughter. Diane hated it, claimed I was being irresponsible, that Mark deserved a wife who brought in more money, not less. Then one evening, after coming home from visiting my sick parents, I walked into our kitchen and Diane was there. Not visiting, not helping, rearranging my entire spice cabinet. "You're barely here," she said with a smug smile. So I thought I'd make this kitchen a bit more functional. Mark just stood there, sheepish. I told him it was time to set boundaries. He told me I was being ungrateful. That night, he sat me down. His mother had suggested we all move in together. "She's getting older, Ava," he said. "We should consider her comfort." Comfort. I was working, raising a child, managing my parents' failing health, and trying to keep our marriage from sinking. And he was worried about his mother's comfort? I told him no. Absolutely not. That's when he dropped the bomb. "Maybe we should just get divorced," he said, arms crossed like he was calling my bluff. "Let's be honest, Ava. You and our daughter wouldn't manage without me." Oh, Mark. I stood up, walked to my office, pulled out the deed to the house, and returned to the kitchen. "You're right," I said. "Maybe we should divorce, but not for the reasons you think." I placed the deed on the table. His eyes scanned it. His jaw dropped. "This house? The one your mother picked out curtains for? The one she calls hers? It's mine. It was mine before we got married. It's still mine now. And if you think for a second that you're going to kick me out of it, you have another thing coming." Diane, who had overheard everything, stormed in with a barrage of insults, accused me of manipulation, of trickery, of being cold. I told her calmly, "The only cold thing here is your heart, and lucky for you, you can now go warm it somewhere else." Mark tried to backtrack, tried to say he was just angry. But it was too late. I called a lawyer the next day. The house? Protected. The custody? In my favor. The divorce? Swift and final. Now, I live in that same house, just me and my daughter. It's quieter, brighter. Diane and Mark tried to play house, but they lost the game because they forgot one simple rule. Don't mess with a woman who has receipts and the deed. I used to think I had the perfect little life. A steady job, a cozy home, a beautiful daughter, and a husband who, at the very least, seemed decent enough. But all of that came crashing down the day my husband Gary and his overbearing mother Carol thought they could intimidate me into giving up what was rightfully mine. What they didn't know was this: the house they believed was theirs, the home they acted like they ran, was actually part of my inheritance. And when they tried to threaten me with divorce, well, I invited them to pack up and move in together, because this house was never theirs to begin with. Let me take you back to how it all started. I met Gary in college. He was charming, funny, and seemed independent. We fell in love like any young couple might, full of hope and excitement for the future. But what I didn't realize until it was far too late was that I wasn't just marrying Gary, I was marrying his mother too. Carol was the kind of woman who made every occasion about herself. At our wedding, she wore white. Not ivory. Not off-white. Actual blinding snow white. When I brought it up to Gary, he shrugged and said, "Mom says it's eggshell." Right. It was about then I should have started running. Still, I stayed. I thought it would get better. I thought once we had our own place, our own child, Carol would take a step back. She didn't. She picked the furniture. She commented on how I folded laundry. She criticized my cooking. She even told me how I should raise our daughter, like I was some kind of clueless teenager and not the woman actually doing all the parenting. And Gary? He sided with her every time. Always with some variation of, "She means well." Things got worse when I started spending more time at my parents' house. They were getting older, needed help, and I wanted to be there for them. Carol didn't like that. She said I was neglecting my duties at home. What she really meant was I wasn't around enough for her to control me. One night, I came home late from my parents' house, emotionally drained and exhausted. Carol was already in the kitchen, arms crossed, judgment oozing from her pores. "Katie," she said in that syrupy sweet voice that always meant trouble, "we need to talk about your priorities." Before I could even respond, Gary jumped in, telling me I was tearing our family apart. He accused me of being selfish, of putting my parents before my own husband and child. And then, oh then, he said the words that changed everything. "If you want a divorce, fine. But don't think you and our daughter will be okay without me." I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because I'd had enough. Finally. Completely. I stood up straight, looked Gary dead in the eye, and said, "Who said I would be the one leaving?" The confusion on his face was priceless. That's when I told him the truth. The house we were living in, the $2 million property they treated like a palace, wasn't his. It was mine. My inheritance. Every mortgage payment, every repair, every utility bill had been paid by me with money my father set aside for me long before Gary ever walked into my life. Carol's face turned pale. Gary stuttered. He tried to argue that as my husband, he had some claim to it, that maybe we should talk to a lawyer. So I did. I called the best lawyer I could afford, the kind of lawyer that makes other lawyers sweat, and we made it very clear. The house was a non-marital asset, inherited, and entirely mine. I gave Gary a choice. He could start acting like a real husband and father, or he could leave. And if he chose to leave, he could take Carol with him. He chose Carol. I served him divorce papers 2 weeks later.